There's an attempt to basically hang the midterm elections around the neck of Donald Trump by people who loathe Donald Trump and have wanted to bring Donald Trump down. Ron DeSantis is a massive, formidable national figure and likely going to be a force for years to come. The left and probably a lot of the GOP establishment would love to see Trump and DeSantis tear each other apart and tear the party asunder. Both make exceptionally compelling cases for why they're the best person to take on Joe Biden or whomever the Democrat nominee is in 2024.
Good evening. Welcome to NTD's Fresh Look America. I'm Paul Graney. Today we're joined by Ben Weingarten. He's a deputy editor at Real Clear Investigations, senior contributor to The Federalist, a fellow at the Claremont Institute, and also the co-host of a very informative podcast called Nat Con Talk. Ben, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's always a pleasure.
Ben, a lot to talk to you about today. I want to get to delayed voting in Nevada and Arizona and some other things related to that, whether it's the voters that count or it's the ballots that count, and if there's any problems with the Republicans' messaging considering the results. I know they're still coming in, but I'd like to get your thoughts. But to begin with, I think the most timely, we'll talk about Trump and DeSantis to begin with, I think. For anyone at home, maybe not up to speed, Trump yesterday kind of railed at the Florida governor for what he says is disloyalty. DeSantis in a debate said he wouldn't rule out, at least he didn't rule out the possibility of running for president in 2024. For Trump, going to run himself, it seems, said that the only reason DeSantis is where he is because of Trump's endorsement in 2018, and the former president a little bit upset about it. I want to get your high-level thoughts and your initial reaction to that, and also, like, what does that mean for people who are looking for perhaps a more unified Republican Party, Ben?
Sure. Well, and I think we're going to see potentially a proxy war or maybe a détente, and I frankly hope a détente here, coming into the December 6th runoff in Georgia, where you've already seen prominent Republicans going to Georgia and campaigning on behalf of and alongside Herschel Walker. It's going to be fascinating to see whether, when, and how Trump and or DeSantis go to Georgia and campaign on Herschel Walker's behalf, and what, if any, effect, to the extent there's a discernible one out there, is seen as a consequence of their endorsing the candidate and championing him there. I think at a high level, there are a couple of narratives that have emerged following election night that I think, and I think there's legitimacy to the narratives, but you also have to factor in the cynical aspect of them. So to speak more directly here, there's an attempt to basically hang the midterm elections around the neck of Donald Trump by people who loathe Donald Trump and have wanted to bring Donald Trump down, going back 6 years plus at this point. And I think it's very cynical. It's also disingenuous, quite frankly. I mean, beyond the fact that multiple hundred candidates that Donald Trump endorsed did win on election night, beyond the fact that Republicans were in a position to take a majority and at minimum in the House, in no small part because it was the Donald Trump MAGA movement that made parts of the country, districts in play, and flipped them in many cases that would never have been remotely possible before Trump. And then when you add in the fact that leadership and the Republican establishment essentially sat on their hands in so many of these close races where Trump went and endorsed, they set him up in some cases to be portrayed as failing or costing Republican seats. So I think there's a disingenuous argument at play here where people who wanted to use election night against Donald Trump grabbed everything they could to use it against him. By the same token, and these two things can both hold, Ron DeSantis did an exceptional job on election night and was absolutely a massive winner on election night. Florida achieved a red wave that has been cresting over several years now, going from a state where he barely won in 2018 governor, of course with, as you noted, Donald Trump's endorsement, to a state that is now bright red, firmly red. And that's in no small part due to the fact that because of DeSantis's policies, anti-woke policies, pro-family policies, pro-parent policies, and the like, he turned Florida into a magnet for conservatives and Republicans from across the country. By the way, Lee Zeldin in New York and New York Republicans broadly had a historically good night in a bright blue state, rather. He might have been, Zeldin and others may have been victims of DeSantis' success when you consider New Yorkers who fled that state over the last several years and went to Florida, which is an interesting dynamic at play here. And that might be the case, and by the way, in other swing districts and swing states from across the country as well.
I want to make a quick note on the people who left places like New York and went to Florida. Conservatives were celebrating at the time. Oh, great, look, they're leaving New York finally. And then they realized, oh, no, it only leaves Democrats left in New York. Besides the point, I just wanted to note that. On Trump, I think it's been interesting to see, look, I can understand the kind of more liberal media are using this to attack Trump. He's finished. Look, this is evidence he's finished. Maybe some of the right-wing media who were never really Trump-friendly also using the opportunity to try and get Trump out of the picture. On Twitter, I feel there are some influential conservatives who in the past were all in on Trump, who have almost went 180 just because of these few comments he's made towards Ron DeSantis. Do you think this is a fringe element? Do you think Trump's base is still fully behind him?
I think that Trump still has a substantial base in this country, and certainly the most intense fan base that turns out in numbers live in person that's unprecedented, and he's an unprecedented political force. By the same token, I think you have particularly intellectual conservatives who have felt for some time and feel validated on election night that essentially they put forth the idea that DeSantis is Trump without whatever Trump's negatives may be, and that he'll be able to win all the Trump voters plus some percentage of purple suburbanites who were turned off because of, quote unquote, mean tweets and the like. And I think we'll see this play out in terms of what rank and file grassroots Republicans and conservatives want. It's a good, healthy thing to hash that out. Of course, the left and probably a lot of the GOP establishment would love to see Trump and DeSantis tear each other apart and tear the party asunder. I hope that cooler heads prevail, but I think it's a healthy thing that there is a competition and that there are two potential presidential candidates out there who can bring to the polls tens of millions of people and who can both make exceptionally compelling cases for why they're the best person to take on Joe Biden or whomever the Democrat nominee is in 2024.
Yeah. Because I think it's been interesting with a lot of these commentators and influencers and thought leaders, everyone celebrated, and everyone in this group celebrated Trump's kind of hard on his sleeve approach, said no filter, says whatever he wants to say, but all of a sudden it's not quite as applicable, it's not quite as desirable anymore. But like people say, Trump, he is Trump, right? That's exactly what he does. I want to ask you on, President DeSantis, how difficult a time does he have if he gets to Washington, D.C., and he has to go through everything like President Trump went through? Because it's going to be as hard, if not even harder, for DeSantis if he gets there. You were talking about spying on his campaign, talking about people, stabbing him in the back. Trump had multiple firings, in the first year, people who he thought he could trust and then he couldn't. How difficult would it be for DeSantis, who's never really been in that environment, to handle all that?
Yeah, well, I think the one advantage that DeSantis would have going in that Trump did not have was that DeSantis is an executive running a state in Florida. He has been in Washington, D.C., in the House, so he knows how the game is played and that politics is a more than full contact sport. By the same token, any candidate, by the way, right or left, because let's not forget when it appeared on the left a couple times that Bernie Sanders might be ascendant, he got knifed in a million different ways. Anyone who is perceived as potentially threatening to upset the apple cart is going to be subjected to an onslaught, presumably the likes of which we've never seen before, unless there's a belief that the candidate can be co-opted or in other ways compromised essentially by an establishment, by the uniparty sort of ruling class. And I believe that neither Trump nor DeSantis would be corrupted and co-opted in such a way, even though you're under intense pressure and scrutiny to do so. But I think you're absolutely right to point out the fact that anyone who would dare to be a change agent is going to have virtually the entirety of the federal bureaucracy against them, are going to have to be ultra prudent and judicious with the people that they appoint at the top ranks, both within their cabinet and their kitchen cabinet, and then to run these agencies, and then several rungs down within these agencies, because there's going to be sabotage and subterfuge within them to the extent you're actually going to put forth an agenda that makes for meaningful difference. You're obviously going to have the entire media against you and every other culturally influential institution. You're probably going to have, to your point, the effort by the national security apparatus, to the extent you're perceived as a threat there, to come after you in a million different ways. And then you're going to have establishment Republicans probably in large number as well going against you. So the forces are arrayed significantly against anyone who would dare to make change. And that's why you really have to have the courage of your convictions to be able to put forth a positive message, a change agent message, and then have a real concrete plan to achieve it. And absolutely vital, of course, the old saying is right, that personnel is policy. The number one most important thing is going to be personnel. And so it'll be interesting to see in the coming days, weeks, and to the extent Ron DeSantis throws his hat into the ring, and we assume that Donald Trump will announce probably on the 15th of this month that he will be running as well. The Trump people have floated out kind of, here's our plan to deal with the bureaucracy on day one, and sideline potentially thousands of people who would otherwise be working to undermine another Trump presidency. Will the DeSantis team also put out something similar? Be fascinating to see how that plays out, and I think it's a standard to which every candidate ought to be held. What are you going to do in the face of a bureaucracy that hates your guts and wants to undermine everything that you're going to want to achieve?
I think it's been incredible. Trump has been the hegemon since 2016. Once it's been 6 years, maybe people on the right, they've forgotten that this is politics at the end of the day. You know what I mean? They may share the same goals genuinely, but they're still politicians. It's still politics. Ben, I want to move on to, we still have counting ongoing in Arizona and Nevada, and no real idea of when that's going to finish. It's slow to a trickle in Arizona. It's been incredible. Like, how damaging is this to the part of the electorate who already did not trust the elections in this country?
Yeah, this only further undermines confidence in the election system, which then undermines confidence in our Republican system of government itself. And it is remarkable, though unsurprising, to witness the fact that the Sunshine State in Florida, with a population of roughly 20 million people, 2 times the combined populations of the Sun Belt states, Arizona and Nevada, got election results within hours on election night, and we knew the results. Arizona and Nevada, for that matter, continue to drag their feet. And this is a direct consequence of the voting system that they have. And you have 2 poles, essentially, in terms of, no pun intended, of an election system that we can have. One is what we had for virtually the entirety of American history, which is overwhelmingly in-person voting on a singular election day with identification, and you had the results night of, usually, by the way, using rudimentary tools like a pen and paper or a simple lever at a voting booth. The other pole is an endless election season, largely held remotely, where you don't know who is casting the ballot, whether they're casting the ballot under potential coercion, pressure, inducement, and you have all manner of questions about the integrity of that vote. And you don't know if it's done in secret. And secret ballot is, of course, one of the most essential aspects of a real free and fair voting system. Your confidence is undermined the further you get from voting in person on election day with ID and with a pen and paper. And your confidence is only further undermined when the count continues endlessly. And it gives the appearance, seemingly, of always being the case where it's in these hotly contested swing state races, and oftentimes it appears the Republican is winning, and then there's a drip, drip, drip. It just saps total confidence in the system, and it shows you the damage, in my view, of the exploitation of the Chinese coronavirus, where temporary measures in too many states across the country became permanent that unmoored us from a system that we can have confidence in the safety, security, and integrity of. It's a travesty and a disaster what's going on in Arizona and Nevada. And even if everything were totally above board in these places, and obviously we have reason to question it, we have reason to question how on election day, the one day of the year and the one job that the tabulation machines have and that the overseers have to make sure that they function, that they malfunction en masse, not just in Maricopa County, Arizona, but in a slew of jurisdictions around the country. Even if everything's above board and there really are technical errors and this is just a matter of being understaffed or the like, it undermines confidence in the entirety of the system. And this is a crisis, and it ought to be treated as a crisis, in my view.
I want to add something about Maricopa County. Look, when the news broke on Tuesday Tuesday morning that the what was the election? I'm all for
Tuesday, correct.
Tuesday morning. It's been a long week. When the news broke on Tuesday morning that these machines had gone down, I was kind of caught a little off guard as well. I said, here we go again. But I also said, oh, it's only 70 polling stations. It's only 70 polling places. Not a major deal. And then I found out later that recently in Arizona, they reduced the number of polling places from 500 and something to 200 and something. It's a massive number of polling places, almost a third of their polling places. Like you said, on election day, the only day of the year you need the machines to work, and all of a sudden they're not working. And look, the conservatives and Republicans will say, like, it's potentially, it harms them. They aren't voting by mail. They don't trust the vote by mail. They want to go there in person. All of a sudden, they can't vote. They're told to wait for hours and hours and hours. And it's just been incredible. And to your point in Florida, that was all done without one single dispute, not one complaint. I spoke with the lady recently from the Election Integrity Project, and she went through all of these things that Governor DeSantis did, like you said, you're reducing mail-in ballots, reducing ballot harvesting, but she said actually for her, the most effective thing he did was this election police force and actually charging people and bringing people to justice for election fraud and election irregularities. She said this was a big deterrent for people to actually commit fraud in the elections. But all over the country, there's really, we rarely, if ever, hear about any kind of repercussions, big or small.
Yeah, and also let's point out that when you have a remote voting system, a disproportionate and increasing remote and early voting system, it makes it that much harder to detect any potential fraud. In some respects, it's kind of amazing that we do have documented instances of fraud, given how easy it would be, or presumably how much easier it would be, to engage in that fraud remotely rather than in person. I think it's also worth noting, just stepping back 30,000 feet, we live in the most technologically advanced civilization in the history of mankind. People have been voting for hundreds of years. How could it be possible that for all that time, we could get roughly accurate election results the night of, with very rare exceptions, and only now we can't? To me, it's not an issue of can't, it's an issue of a willingness. And it opens up questions about what are the incentives for having a system like this when you know that we're not getting the results, and we're now normalizing, after 2 cycles of this, these constant questions around the integrity and getting gaslit by the media that, oh, this is perfectly common and normal. It's simply not. It defies reality. The American people see this, but their representatives have to see it as well, and they have to be enticed to put in the kind of restrictions to ensure that we really do still have a republic. We shouldn't have to worry about the system. We should only have to worry about the candidates themselves, who puts forth the best arguments, and may the best candidate win. Instead now, we have to worry about the process and who exploits the process the best before we even get to the merits of the candidates. And that's a dire indictment, I think, of the way that we've trended in this country, unfortunately.
2 points on that. During the election night, we had a big operation here. I don't know, dozens of reporters on the ground, multiple studios across the country, big effort for weeks trying to put it together. And then when you hear things like this about mail-in ballots, voting machines going down, all of these things, and you're in studio, you're discussing Republicans' messaging, the Democrats' platform, all of these things, and then everyone sits back and wonder, is there any point? If we can't even trust the elections, if we can't even trust the results we're getting, is there any point in discussing anything? And to reach that level of cynicism is really a problem. I want to get your view on this, partly from a national conservative perspective. What is the solution? Because understandably, the elections have been left with the states. But if we have people, take for example, Katie Hobbs is the Secretary of State and she's running for governor. We have the recorder in that state who's running for Secretary of State. The people who are controlling the elections are in the elections. So what is the solution to give Americans some sense of hope?
Well, one thing I will say is thank God that we have a federalist system and that despite efforts, particularly among Democrats in Congress, to try to federalize elections, they haven't, because that is one safeguard, and there is a competition among the states here based upon the confidence that their systems inspire. So thank God, first of all, for federalism, and we need to do everything that we can from a defensive perspective to stop the attempted federalization of elections. And by the way, we could spend a whole show talking about the Biden administration's executive order to turn every federal agency into a voter registration and participation center, potentially in partnership with third-party groups, likely progressive-aligned third-party groups. And the administration has obfuscated in terms of how that actually was implemented and executed going into this election. And we don't know how massive and how massively significant it was, to the extent that you had administration-aligned groups going out there and registering voters at government offices that they were likely the beneficiaries of. And so there's an obvious apparent conflict there. Set that aside for a moment. I think there's only two things that can be done going forward, given the forces arrayed here in terms of the way the system has been set up and then the way Democrats have exploited it to maximum extent, to their credit. One is, when these systems are in place, Republicans will have to compete using the exact same tactics that Democrats do. They're coming at it from a huge disadvantage in terms of their ability to register voters and drive them out and to vote early and to ballot harvest, even though I think that ballot harvesting is a horrible election integrity undermining practice. But where this is lawful, where it's on the books, you have to compete equally as hard. You can't compete with two hands behind your back. But then when you get into power and you win, you have to eviscerate these systems that undermine confidence. That's the only way. So it's compete as best you can in a system that appears to be flawed and is anti-Republican in nature, in my view. And then when you win, change that system. That's the simplest answer. But it's a huge uphill battle, in no small part because Democrats have built a constellation, massive mega donors, massive nonprofit organizations, massive dark money spending that dwarfs significantly the Republican electioneering apparatus. And so that puts Republicans at a significant disadvantage, even before you get to who actually staffs the election offices and who are the groups that are advising those election offices, like we saw with Zuckerbucks in 2020 and may have seen with essentially Biden bucks in 2022.
Incredible. Look, I understand where you're coming from. It's just, how do we get here, right? That is the big question. Like you said, we could do a whole show on how we got here, but here we are. Ben, I want to get on to the last main point. Was there problems with the messaging on the Republican side? We heard about a red wave. Okay, it could still come. I don't think it was, depending on how these final few races play out, I don't think it was a terrible night for Republicans, but it wasn't like people were expecting. Was there a problem in messaging or approach from the Republican Party?
Well, I think the explicit message from leadership, at the Senate level among Republicans was essentially don't put forth a positive, specific, concrete message. Let your opponent hang himself. At the House level, there was a bit more of a proactive message in terms of, something like a 50-point plan, paraphrasing, here's what Republicans will do if they're in power. But I'd make a couple points. You knew explicitly what the Democrat message was, which is that essentially our opponents are evil, terroristic, theocratic. They want to ban abortion everywhere, and they hate women. And by the way, unmarried women voted at Democrat plus 37, according to one statistic in this contest. Every other cohort, married women, married men, unmarried men, all voted at a Republican plus margin. So maybe you argue that that worked. And then also that democracy, so-called our democracy, was on the ballot. I'm not sure how vital that messaging was. I think that arguably, based upon the turnout and other metrics that we'll analyze in coming days, the push, the anti-Dobbs push, probably made a meaningful impact, at least at state levels, if it didn't have an impact necessarily in individual races. I'm thinking of college campuses, for example, and driving out the vote there, and how impactful that could have been within critical states. But look, at a very simple level, voters said going into the election that inflation / the economy was their number one concern. And obviously you had all of these metrics indicating this should be a shellacking for Democrats. They're overseeing massive increase in crime, devaluation of the dollar in your pocket, chaos abroad, a highly unpopular president, 3/4 of the public plus thinking that we're moving in a terrible direction, et cetera. And it's a midterm election. So all the fundamentals are there for Republican red wave. However, I made this point to friends, colleagues, et cetera. Okay, if inflation / economy is the number one issue, what exactly was the Republican response to here's what we're going to do to drive down inflation, or at least check the president in his worst policies that may prove inflationary? And I don't think anyone could define what the Republican message was explicitly. They were defensive, I think, largely. They did not run here's what our opponent is doing to make your life materially worse, to make you poorer and less safe. Here's how they're doing it. And here's concretely what we are going to do to defend the American way of life and then make your life better going into 2024. I don't think that message was ever articulated. I certainly can't point to articulation of that. And a content-free message where it's simply that the other side is doing a horrible job is not going to win. I go back to 2016 as a good example of this. I have no idea what Hillary Clinton's message was in 2016, but you knew very clearly what Donald Trump's message was. Build the wall, take on China, stand with the American worker, make America great again, period, full stop, in all these myriad ways, take on the establishment, drain the swamp, et cetera. Bumper sticker, 3-word sentences. I don't think that Republicans had that this cycle, and you have to have a bold national vision, even if the other opponent looks to be severely wounded on paper. It didn't happen, and I think that's one of the myriad reasons, and there are many of them, why the predicted red wave crashed.
I want to just add to your point about the messaging. I followed Lee Zeldin quite closely. I'm here in New York City, and his message was very clear, right? Day one, crime emergency. Day one, crime emergency. He just repeated it over and over again, and it stuck. Look, he didn't win, but that guy performed well. Ben, I feel I could talk to you all day, but I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been a real pleasure. Ben Weingarten, Real Clear Investigations. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.